besides write psychology lessons?
No, of course not. My whole life revolves around my students. So, can you help me figure out an interesting way to teach the nature versus nurture debate? I was thinking about using a cheesy sitcom idea to introduce it.
Why would anyone want to watch a sitcom about a psychology teacher? It sounds pretty boring. So, how about this nature versus nurture thing?
Well, basically, I just want to explain to my students how genetics and the environment work together to influence human behavior and thinking.
Oh, so it's kind of like this. The nature theory says that I'm genetically predisposed to be awesome. And the nurture theory says that my parents raised me to be awesome.
Alright, so how do you explain how you always eat chips and salsa?
Well, I grew up in a Mexican restaurant.
Okay, tell me why you always wear a Hawaiian shirt then.
Well, the restaurant was in Hawaii.
Alright, this week we will be discussing nature versus nurture. This is a debate that spreads across all different kinds of fields of study, from biology to sociology to psychology. And so what we want to ask ourselves is, how do genes, i.e. heredity, interact with the environment to determine human behavior and thinking? Remember, our major goal as future psychologists are that we are interested in finding out causes of human behavior and thinking, influences of human behavior and thinking. So we're going to be looking at how our genetics interact with our environment to make us think, act, behave a certain way. So the big idea that we want to understand is that, first of all, philosophers and scientists have passionately debated this question for centuries, and they used to think it was maybe more one versus the other. Nature had a larger role in influencing anything related to humans, or nurture had a larger role in and influencing the outcome of anything related to humans. So we do really need to define what nature is and what nurture is. First of all, nature refers to the genetic material we inherit from our parents. So if you remember back to your biology class when we talked about DNA and chromosomes and all that kinds of stuff, that's what we're talking about here. Nurture refers to the environment that we live in, our families, our towns, the culture that we live in, our society, etc. So how do these things influence our behavior and thinking? People used to think that it was just one versus the other. Now that we know a little bit more about how genes work, we realize that it's really the two together that influence human behavior and thinking. So first of all, let's take a little review time. Remember how genes work. So first of all, genes are segments of DNA strands which then make up chromosomes. So you can see your genes are on right here. These are different types of genes, whatever they are, they form together. They're on different strands of DNA. So this is actually a segment of DNA, and just any given spot on your DNA will have a gene. The strand as a whole, these are your DNA strands, will form chromosomes. Chromosomes will have over 25,000 genes. That's pretty crazy. We do have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total, in each one of our cells. All of this is given to us by our parents. Remember, our parents give us half of their DNA each to form our total DNA. Alright, so genes do work as the guideline for building the brain. Remember, we learned last week in week 3 with the brain and neuroscience that it's the brain that does the physical operations of our body. It's the command center that keeps our body going. It's also the command center of the mental processing. So genes do determine how your brain is going to work before you are even born, which is a little bit crazy to think about. However, genes can be turned on or off like a switch. We're going to talk more about this when you do your DBQ for this unit, but we're going to learn in a minute that there are certain things that can trigger genes to be turned on or off like a switch. But first we actually want to look at the brain and genes and how they work together. That's right, we cannot get away from the brain. You can see here the brain from Animaniacs dangling the world on a little keychain, wishing for power and control over the whole world. But for me, this picture kind of represents how the brain works within the confines of our environment to help us act and behave a certain way, I guess. All right, so what does the brain do? There are neural connections that trigger those genes to help develop the characteristics we have, the traits that we have. However, we learned last week about neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain can regrow brain cells, those neurons, and they will actually eliminate old neural connections that we no longer use. So what guidelines or what guides the brain to determine which neural connections to keep and which to eliminate? How does the brain know which neural connections to trigger which genes that we should have and which ones are old, we don't need anymore? Where does the brain get that kind of information from? Remember, the brain interacts with your environment, with your experiences. So the brain, remember that the brain from Animaniacs is holding the world. You can think about the world keychain representing experiences. So the brain will keep neural connections that we use all the time and will trash or throw out the ones that we don't. So those neural connections that work to trigger genes, which we'll talk more about in a minute, will actually be gotten rid of if we don't use them all the time. So just because we might have some sort of genetic tendency to behave or act in a certain way, if we never actually experience that behavior or thinking in a certain way, the brain will kind of get rid of it. All right, so what are experiences then? That's whatever happens to us in our environments as we grow up. But didn't I just say that environment works with genes together? There's some sort of mutual give and take to influence human behavior and thinking. Oops. Yep, I sure did. Genes help determine what is possible for us to experience in our environment. An example of this would be, I will never be a football star, no matter how much I might like watching the Buckeyes play on Saturdays or follow football, no matter how much I understand the rules or can actually play the game. It's not within my genes to be an athlete. It just isn't going to happen. I can play football, but I'm never going to excel at it. So my genes have determined what's possible for me to experience in my environment. I can watch football, but I will never be able to be on the field playing with the Buckeyes and have Urban Meyer as my coach. However, the environment also stimulates the brain to work within the parameters set by our genes. So the environment will let the brain know, hey, this is what the person's doing, you need to keep this information, or they don't really need that information. So it's kind of like the environment and the genes work together to be pruning shears to get rid of all of the extra fluff that we don't need and really zero in on our genetic information that keeps us going in the interests and talents and abilities that we have. All right, so nature and nurture do work together to influence behavior and thinking. So our genes do give us predispositions, I mentioned this earlier, to act and think in a certain way, to have certain interests, possess certain abilities and skills, to have certain personalities even. These genetic tendencies influence us to pursue certain environments and avoid others. For example, someone who's introverted will choose to read in a park where it's quiet and they can focus, have some downtime. Extroverts, however, if they're going to work on their homework or something like that, they're going to choose a loud coffee shop with lots of people where they can pick up on that energy and just really use it to be productive in their schoolwork. All right, so there are genetic predispositions for a person to be either an introvert or an extrovert, and those predispositions will influence you to choose the environments that you work really well with and avoid the ones that you don't work really well with. So Our environments also influence our genes by triggering genetic tendencies into action, which we talked about earlier. All right, so let's think of an example of how nature and nurture works together to influence behavior and thinking. First of all, let's think about little girls that want to grow up to be ballerinas. A parent could provide ballet lessons to their child that will create an environment in which that little girl's predisposition to be graceful and flexible will produce a talented ballerina. However, that same little girl can have those genetic predispositions to be graceful and flexible. Those are two requirements that are pretty important in great dancers. But if they're never taught how to dance, maybe their parents can't afford to send them to ballet lessons, they're not going to be a great dancer. Maybe they will be able to pick up on it pretty quickly as adults, but by that point in time it's kind of late in our culture to start your career as a dancer. So if as a child you're really reliant on the environment that your parents provide to you, and so you still have those genetic predispositions of flexibility and gracefulness, and they'll come out in other ways, but you have never had the lessons to really put those genetic predispositions to work to make you be an awesome ballerina. All right, another example. First of all, humans, as you know, are genetically wired to speak and develop speech. Most humans have this ability. That's one of the big things that separates us from animals, is that we can speak logical thoughts, rational thoughts, speak back and forth. But we do know from case studies of feral children or wild children that our environment is what triggers the process of learning how to talk. So a child will only learn how to talk when exposed to speech. They have to hear someone else talk with them, talk to them, in order to develop that process, that ability to actually speak and not just mimic sounds. All right, so as we wrap up, the essential question that I want you to approach the readings and the assignments, the DBQ, the lesson quiz with, is how do genes and environment work together to influence behavior and thinking? Keeping in mind that it used to be one versus the other. You're going to see examples of that in the readings and the assignments, but as scientists are continually researching our genetic material, we do really see that there's this mutual role of give and take between genes and environment to influence behavior and thinking.